Unrest, a documentary by Jennifer Brea, was screened on November 12, 2017 at the Regent Theatre in Arlington, Massachusetts. This is the event's opening talk and post-film panel. It does not include the actual film, Unrest, which is available on Amazon and iTunes. The panel includes a scientific researcher, a medical professional, a women's health advocate, and an ME advocate. The event raised awareness about a neuroimmune disease largely ignored by the medical community, ME, Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, also known as CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. There are 28,000 Massachusetts residents, 1 to 2.5 million Americans, and 17 to 20 million around the globe disabled by ME, many homebound and bedridden. Approximately 75% of people with ME are women. Learn more about the film at www.unrest.film. Watch Unrest on Amazon and iTunes. Learn more about ME at masscfids.org.
On behalf of the Massachusetts CFS, ME, and FM Association, we welcome you. I'm Rivka Solomon. I'm a person with ME, CFS, which stands for Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Or most of us call it ME, which is the name that the World Health Organization gave it. I have spent much of the past 27 years homebound and bedridden. Today is an aberration, and I'm feeling very grateful for that. Today, we're holding a special screening of Unrest, followed by a panel discussion and an audience Q&A. So, you may think that you're here to see a film, just a film. But actually, what you are witnessing today, is a tipping point in action. A disease that impacts millions, a disease that's been hidden for the last 30 years, is now coming out of the shadows and into the light. And the film Unrest is playing a big role in that. As many of you know, it won a Sundance Film Festival Award, a Boston Globe Film Festival Award, and now it's an Oscar contender. I know, pretty amazing. The film and ME have recently been covered in the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, National Public Radio, and PBS with Tavis Smiley. ME is not a rare disease. There are an estimated 28,000 with ME in Massachusetts, 1 to 2.5 million in the US, and 17 to 20 million around the globe. And for 3 decades, these patients have been forgotten, ignored, stigmatized, and psychologized. But today, including this event, the landscape for ME is shifting. It's shifting in part because of the critical mass of 150 of you who are here today, who are healthcare professionals, coming to learn about ME directly from ME patients, advocates, and researchers. This is a first for Massachusetts with this critical number. Today, the landscape for ME is shifting also because for the first time we have a significant number of organizations who are from a wide variety of backgrounds, all co-sponsoring an ME event, all declaring support for ME patients. We have government, healthcare, disability, arts, academic, religious, and women's organizations all coming together for ME awareness. This is a first. This is groundbreaking, not just in Massachusetts, not just in the US, but from what we can tell, this diversely sponsored event has never happened before anywhere in the globe. And tonight is groundbreaking for one more reason. For this event, the entire Massachusetts Congressional Delegation on Capitol Hill, that means our 2 senators, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey, and our 9 members of Congress have united for the first time in a joint statement of support for ME patients. And they said, without meaningful and immediate investments in biomedical research, that 28,000 people living with ME/CFS in Massachusetts will struggle to find answers to critical questions about the disease's cause, diagnosis, and treatment. Events like today's, bolstered by the advocacy and outreach performed by many in this room, has helped to bring this devastating condition out of the shadows and into the spotlight. We, the Massachusetts Congressional Delegation, will keep our constituents with ME/CFS in mind as we push for expanded biomedical research opportunities and funding in the U.S. House and Senate. What you are witnessing here today is a tipping point in action. Enjoy the film.
I'm Leah Williams from the Massachusetts CFIDS ME and FM Association. We are one of the oldest and most active state patient organizations. We do patient services, we host events like this one to raise awareness, and we also do advocacy on the local, state, and national level. So we are entirely volunteer organization. We are entirely supported by individual donations. So if you want to help, that would be great. If you want to organize a showing of Unrest at your institution or business, that would be fantastic. You could note that on this clipboard, or you can email us at Mass CFIDS. So I'm going to hand it over to the Deb Becker, who is our panel moderator.
Hello, welcome everyone. What a crowd. What a movie, huh? I hadn't seen it before, and I just thought it was amazingly powerful, and so many threads in that story, really. You know, love and resilience and the human spirit, and of course the healthcare system and how the healthcare system reacts when it doesn't understand things sometimes. And also a story of, I think, how things like this require a core group of caring, dedicated, open-minded people to help change things. And we're very lucky that we have some of those folks with us here for this discussion. Mary Dimmock had a 31-year career in the pharmaceutical industry, and after she retired, and about 7 years ago, her son got ME, and Mary became a full-time advocate. She focuses on the importance of educating the medical community about ME, addressing the stigma and the poor quality of clinical care, and getting government agencies to expedite research and drug development. So I'm going to ask each panelist a question before I turn it over to them so they can tell us a little bit about themselves and the work they do. So I'm just wondering, Mary, why don't you tell us some of the current efforts regarding advocacy, especially trying to get some funding from the medical community?
There's two aspects of it, but obviously funding is a huge one, and we've increased funding a little bit, but the funding is nowhere near what it needs to be. I would say additionally to funding, putting in place a plan that will encourage more researchers into the field. Lack of funding has been a key issue, but also get clinical trials going and other things going that can have an immediate impact. The other piece that I focus on is medical care, because no matter what we do with research, it's going to take a while to make a difference in the lives of patients. But there are things that the medical community can do today, and that's really important that change.
As an advocate, just a quick follow-up, as an advocate, when you saw what was happening in the film and the demonstrations and all the work and even the creation of a film like this, how much does that affect policy and affect research to moving closer to trying to figure out what's going on with ME?
There's nothing in this film that we haven't known for 30 years. What we have lacked is acceptance. What we have lacked is the truth about what this disease is. This disease has been psychologicalized, and that has impacted everything, from research to drug development to clinical care to the support from the public and families. And so what this film will do is to increase awareness and make it impossible to look away from what's really been going on with this disease.
Our panelists on the far end there, I'm sorry I went out of order, Lisa Hall. Lisa has been a head nurse at Northampton Integrative Medicine, one of Massachusetts' largest clinics, serving patients with chronic illnesses such as ME, Lisa facilitates and coordinates care for patients. So Lisa, what I'd like to ask you, what is it like to treat and care for ME patients? And do you have to individualize treatments for each patient? How does that work?
Absolutely. At our clinic, being alternative, we're both looking at things from the conventional medical side and also from the alternative side. All of our practitioners are very open-minded and very eager to find new ways to look at things, to think outside the box. So when we look at a patient, it's very individual. We're looking at their hormones and their nutrition. We're looking at every aspect of their health. We're looking at the infections. Do they have viral infections, bacterial infections? And often our patients bring us new treatments that another specialist has come up with, and the doctors will vet them and say, well, that seems safe enough. I don't know if it's going to work, but let's give it a try. And nevertheless, over the 16 years I've worked there, we're still shooting in the dark. You know, we sometimes can get people a little bit better, and then sometimes that benefit goes away and we don't know why. And so, you know, we're doing the best that we can, and we really, like everyone else, have no way to get these people's lives back for them. And that's why there must be research, so that all the clinicians have some way to help.
And a follow-up quickly, you mentioned infection, and we heard a lot about that. Would you say, do you even know, I know there's not much research, but is there a percentage of cases where you think infection is really sort of seemingly a primary cause?
Certainly hard to say. I mean, the typical history of this condition is I got really sick and I've never been the same since. So yeah, maybe they had an infection, but what's going on in the body that they can't get better? You know, and even when we put patients on that very potent antiviral Valsite, by the way, when you are on that medication as a woman of childbearing age, you have to sign a statement that you will use 2 forms of birth control because you really cannot have a baby on that medicine. Bad things will happen. So, you know, that's a scary medicine. Even on that medicine, some people get better, some people don't. It's really hard to watch people go through this year after year, as we saw in the film.
Okay, our next panelist is Kiki Zeldis. Kiki became sick with ME 27 years ago. After several years of not being able to work, she now does work part-time at Our Bodies, Ourselves, which is a women's health advocacy organization. And Kiki, what I'd like to ask you, if you could just share your story a bit with the audience before you got ME and how it is now, how your life is now.
Yeah, sure. I first became ill with some kind of severe infection, and you know, I can tell you the date I got sick, August 4th, 1990. I spent about 2.5 years really, really ill, just, you know, I feel very, in retrospect, you know, lucky compared to people in this film. I've always been able to take care of myself, and I haven't had a lot of cognitive symptoms, which I'm really grateful for. But I monitor my energy level constantly. There's a constant, I take 2 naps a day at very sick times. I think the only day in 27 years I haven't done that is the day my son was born. And it's just an incredibly psychologically hard illness. I feel like I have to sort of imagine myself, like most people sleep for 8 hours and then they have, you know, the rest of the 18 hours of good time. And I feel like I have probably 4 to 6 pretty good hours in a day. And so there's a constant monitoring of how do I prioritize and simplifying my life in as many ways as I can, and really choosing everywhere I want to place my energy because it's limited and valuable.
And did you have difficulty with the think my mic is, oh, there it is. Did you have difficulty with trying to get a diagnosis and did you find something that you think helped you?
It's a great question. I think in some ways I had an unusual circumstance because I knew someone who had chronic fatigue syndrome before I was sick. And I always completely believed her. I mean, I was always like, why would anyone, pretend to be this debilitated and have this many limitations on their life and be this sick? So I actually was suspicious that I had it very, very early on and was diagnosed right at the 6-month mark, which is when they say you can't get diagnosis until you have been sick for that long. And I spent about probably 5 or 6 years trying everything under the sun that I could possibly imagine and that anyone would suggest. And there have been a few things that have helped symptomatically. I've taken trazodone to help with sleep. I pace big time, and I haven't really found, for a long time I tried everything, and then I just sort of burned out and got worried about harming my body by trying too many things. And so I think when I go through worse crashes and I'm in a more desperate stage, then I go online and I see what have they figured out since then, what are new treatments coming along, what's the new science saying. But most of the time I try to just take care of myself as best as I can. And there are just so many people out there saying, have you tried our blue-green algae? Have you tried our, there's just a million, exercise and eat well and do this nutritionally. And I feel like they all kind of make me crazy and none have made me feel better. I've tried so many things so that I really just stick with resting, pacing, and just generally trying to take care of myself as well as I can. And, just really hope that some of the really promising research that's out there, and there is some very promising research, will come to fruition and there'll be some kind of treatment.
That's a great segue to our next panelist. Yeah, clap. Dr. Michael Van Elziger is an ME researcher at Harvard Medical School. Let's see, he always looked also at the Neurotherapeutics Division at Mass General Hospital. He's also an instructor at Tufts University. His research includes brain imaging to look for evidence of altered immune and metabolic function in people with ME. So, of course, the big question to you is, what is some of the exciting ME research that's going on right now?
I think Mary is right in saying that most are things we've known about for a long time. There's metabolic issues, probably centered on mitochondria. There's neurological issues, probably centered on the interface between the immune system and the nervous system that allows the nervous system to be inflammatory. So what we're doing now, I think, is to get specific and to find actual, what we call biomarkers, that allow us to have a measurement of severity or some kind of a comparison between healthy people and people who are sick. Because one of the things that I think is really important is objective measures. There's a lot of, some of the treatment studies have been sort of psychologically focused, and the outcomes have been surveys and questionnaires. So if you tell someone for 6 months, you're not sick, you're not sick, you're not sick, and then you ask them to fill out a questionnaire, they'll probably respond, you're right, I'm a little better. And that doesn't necessarily mean that their physical functioning is better, that they can walk further, they can concentrate better and things like that. So one of the things that I think is really promising is the specific, a study just came out last week showing mitochondrial abnormalities. If we follow up with that, and it seems to be predictive, and that can be the sort of thing that we can actually take these cells from people and say, okay, yes, they are getting better, no, they're not, and that sort of thing.
What kind of treatments might be available if you could identify a few things.
I'm skeptical. I know this may sound like bad news, but I'm skeptical of the idea that we're ever going to have just a pill that cures this condition. What I think is that there are multiple systems. There may be some variance among people in how badly each of these systems is off, and we can target these systems specifically. So I'm imagining that there's going to be multiple approaches. Some people have gotten better with transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation. It hasn't worked for everyone. Some people, they've gotten a little better. Some people have gotten well. This is an electroceutical, so it's an electrical medical device that specifically targets a circuit in the body that is supposed to be an anti-inflammatory reflex that seems to be off in folks with this condition. Some people have gotten better with mestinin, which is a drug that targets the autonomic system, a specific neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Some people have gotten better with antivirals, but the thing is there's no one thing that seems to work for everyone. So I think one of the issues really is going to be helping clinicians understand the mechanisms at play so they can think critically about each individual patient. It's not 100% clear if everybody with this condition has the exact same thing. There do seem to be clusters in outbreaks where it seems to be the case that these folks have something really similar. But I think an important thing is allowing clinicians to think critically about these systems. For example, the interaction between the nervous system and the immune system. If someone went to medical school after about before about 1997, they simply wouldn't know some of these mechanisms. They're newly discovered. And so helping clinicians understand the mechanisms at play may help them think critically about their patients.
So part of the problem is the disease can be a little bit different in everybody, and also that this is very new science.
It's very new science. It's not clear that everybody has the same thing. I think that there are probably underlying mechanisms, and it's likely that the outbreaks have the same condition. But you hear different stories. Some folks have mono, they got mono and then never got better. Some folks went on vacation in Colombia, they were sick, they never got better. Some folks were in in one of these buildings in the Incline Village that seemed to be filled with toxic mold, and they had high levels of herpes strains viruses. So being able to think critically about each individual patient, I think, is going to be key.
And just briefly, we heard some numbers about how many people in Massachusetts might be affected, tens of thousands, 1 million to 2 million around the world. But it seems with those difficulties in understanding, there would be difficulties in diagnosing. How many people would you think are truly affected by this? Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know.
knows.
If I may, one of the things that's important to note is that there's a spectrum of severity. So you see, like Whitney Defoe was the young man that was a photographer, Ron Davison and Janet's son. He's very severe, to the point where lights, noise, things like that can be physically painful. Not everyone is that severe. Some folks can go to work and that is enough that wrecks them and they need to go home and crash, and they can rally the next day, and that's it. That's their life, and that's that's sort of on the less severe side. There are probably people who deal with this condition that haven't even been diagnosed yet. It's really tough to know.
I want to allow some of you to be able to ask questions as well. Now you sort of know what our panelists do, what their areas of expertise might be. So, anyone have a question?
Hi, I've done everything for 50 years, pioneering it. I'm grateful to all of you. My question is to Michael. I used to be with MGH, 26 years. Are they funding you properly? How do we get them to be an advocate? Because their voice would be pretty good.
So no self-respecting scientist would ever say, I have enough money. So I'm not going to say that. But can I just ask how many people from MGH are here today? Just, there's a bunch. So I know some colleagues and friends, you know, and my lab is in the back there. So, you know, everything I've done thus far has been generously donated by my center, which is the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging. It's sort of a center that specifically does brain imaging, that's affiliated with Mass General and Harvard Medical School and some other schools. But they've been really generous. You know, I have to say that everybody I talk to is interested. They're collaborative. They take the questions seriously. So far, all of my scans have been paid for by my center with the expectation that it's an investment, that I will get pilot data and apply for greater funding from which they can take 15% for overhead, which is just how the funding works. But in my experience, and understand I'm in the research side, not the clinical side. So in my experience on the research side, people are really interested and engaged, and they want to help and be involved. You know, on the clinical side, it's tough because there's not really anyone that specializes in this condition, and it's frustrating when you know, patients write to me every day and ask what they can do, who they can talk to, and I'm unable to tell them, go see this doctor. There is a pulmonologist that we're collaborating with on I think a pretty cool study at Brigham and Women's. So I mean, I guess two things. If people want to participate in research, you can find out information in the back. I left some flyers out for you to fill in information. We're also opening up a crowdfunding option where if people want to donate directly to pay for scans. One of the scans we're trying to do costs about $5,900 a patient to do a scan, so you can see how pricey this is. If you're on disability, please don't donate. And I'm being serious, and please donate to this organization first, but if you're able, you know, this is one of the things that you can do to help. Does that answer your question? If you're a patient, you can get involved in a study. That will help, and if you're a patient's family member, you can get involved as a healthy control. That's useful to have healthy people to compare to, especially if they're siblings and things like that, so we know that you have some you know, shared genetics. Those are two good ways, and just share the information you know, about the crowdfunding if people want to donate.
Has anyone, you know, I'm a primary care doctor in the community, and it's pretty apparent that we have no ammunition to fight this thing. What have y'all found helpful as patients and as people who take care of folks with ME? What have you found helpful from the medical community?
I think as a person with ME/CFS, what I find most helpful is for someone, one, to completely acknowledge my lived experience, and two, to acknowledge how much is unknown. You know, a lot of people like to think that there's an answer, and we all, you know, we all want to have some control over life and would like to believe we have answers. But I actually find it much more helpful when a physician or provider is able to say, just acknowledge, I know there's research happening on it, I know you're probably more up to date than I am about it, and I know that we don't have the answer yet. We would know if there were an answer. Everybody would know. So I find it most helpful when a provider comes with an open mind, comes with an awareness of how much still needs to be known, and then can sort of look and see if there's any help that can be done symptomatically. Like, okay, there's nothing we can do to treat this. That's a given. But is there anything that will make your insomnia a little less debilitating, or your pain less debilitating, or your cognitive symptoms, or your energy level? That's what I most appreciate in a provider.
I wanted to add on to that. It's really important to be able to help patients understand what pacing means, what their energy envelope means. to make sure they don't overdo it, because just helping them understand that alone can help reduce some of the symptoms. It mitigates against exacerbation of their symptoms. I think the other thing that's really important, it's pretty prevalent in the medical community and in clinical guidelines to tell patients to exercise. You really need to understand that patients have aerobic impairment and they cannot exercise that back to goodness. It's really, really important to keep underneath their anaerobic threshold, to only work if they do any kind of activity, to be very conscious of how long they're doing it for. And understanding the nature of the energy impairment here is really important in terms of helping these patients.
I'd like to add to that too. It's like, if providers are so likely to, even if they get it, to say, okay, keep your energy envelope really low, do some moderate stretching, a little bit of walking as you're able. But what they really need to say is, instead of saying just build up really, really, really slowly, which is everybody says, walk for 2 minutes for 2 weeks and then go to 3 minutes. But it's actually much more helpful for someone to say to me, the second you feel tired, you stop, or you will pay big time. There's no build-up, there's no using logic or reason, and it's what we all want to do, right? We want to say to slowly build up, but it works for many healthy people, can work up, exercise that way, it works. But it absolutely does not work for people with ME/CFS, and if I am able on a day to go for a walk 5 minutes, I appreciate it. And if the next day I'm in bed for most of the day, then I don't. You have to go on how you feel.
I had a question up here, if I could comment to share with folks who have this, and also a question that goes along with it. I was sick for 3 years continuously, not at this severity, maybe 70% of this, and tried everything out there, 25 types of symptoms. But I experienced a 85 to 90% recovery that's been continued for a year and a half with low-dose Naltrexone. I saw every kind of practitioner out there, rheumatologists, infection disease specialists, multiple integrative doctors, and that for me, the doctor John Bordick in Wellesley used to be with Marino. He said 1 in 10 have a strong response. I had a superior response. 3 in 10 have somewhat a moderate response. It's something to check into, and I'm curious about what's going on in the research about that.
Can I just ask, Naltrexone as in the Vivitrol drug that's teaching?
Low dose. Naltrexone at 50 milligrams up is for people dealing with addiction, alcoholism or addiction. Low dose, meaning 1.5, 3, or 4.5 milligrams, has been useful in this and many other immune-related and all kinds of conditions.
Thoughts on that, Lisa? Yeah, the low-dose naltrexone has the effect of sort of calming the autoimmune activity of the body. It works on the beta endorphins and the TH4, TH2 shift, which has something to do with your immune system. That's about all I know about it. But it does sort of reset the immune system and kind of, like when you turn off your computer and wait a while and turn it back on again, and now it's working a little better for some people. So that's definitely an interesting option that we do use.
One thing that's going to be really important is figuring out whether all of us who have this constellation of symptoms, whether we all have the same illness or not. And most likely we don't, and most likely there's subgroups. I used low-dose naltrexone. I tried it for 9 months. I never felt a thing. But I know there are people who do it. And the other thing to really remember about research is that we use these specific numbers. I mean, some numbers are hard numbers, like how much funding we've had for the illness and stuff, but many numbers when we say how many people are affected, how many people have these symptoms, how severely people are affected. The honest truth is there have been some survey studies looking at that, but we do not know. There are probably many, many undiagnosed people. There are probably many people with diagnoses of other diagnoses that actually meet the criteria for ME/CFS. So I think it's just, more than anything, we just have to remember there is a desperate need for research to understand what's going on for people, and to follow up on some of these research treatments that are promising for some people, while acknowledging we just do not have good treatments that work for any, big group of people.
Question?
First, I want to thank everybody here for coming, including my mom, who's 84. So I've had this since the 70s, and I have a lot of other issues, heavy metal, toxicity, etc. I work full time. What do you suggest I can do in the workplace to help my employer, my supervisor, my big boss understand that lately when I've been out 1 day a week for 3 months, that I'm not just playing?
Let me speak to that.
Yeah, Lisa, what do you tell your patient?
Well, what I do a lot is write letters. I write letters, I draft them, and our practitioners sign them. A letter from an MD that explains this condition and says, patient is going to need to take time when her energy is gone, when it's down, and that this is a condition that is characterized by waxing and waning of energy. Energy management is essential, and if you want to keep your good employee, give them the time off and work around it. And again, speaking to the primary care doctor, this is a really important thing, is to give the support to the patients. And a lot of the time, a letter from a doctor can make a difference.
Another question.
A question about diagnosis. At first, it was very difficult to make a diagnosis from watching the movie. As of now, are there quicker ways or tests that you have to make a definitive diagnosis?
I can speak to that. Really, this is one of the things that most needs research, because we don't have a specific marker for, now we know this person's positive for this condition. This is one of the reasons why it is not well recognized, because conventional doctors want to see, you did the test, it came out positive, okay, now we know what we're dealing with. And we really need to get this research.
Mary, did you want to add to that too?
I was just going to say the CDC has put up new guidelines in the last 4 months or so that call out much more specifically recognizing PEM and explaining what those are. So some of the past diagnostic ambiguity and misdiagnosis was because the criteria that were being used were so impossibly broad. So that, while I agree with you, we need biomarkers, we need research for biomarkers, but also just helping by understanding PEM, especially unrefreshing sleep, because they're so distinctive and so easy to recognize once you understand it, I think will help a lot.
Did you want to add to that?
PEM, for people who don't know, is post-exertional malaise. Malaise is sort of a weak term, but it's essentially what Jen was talking about in the film, where people's symptoms spike the day after exertion. And there is a test that seems to be pretty good for that, but it's a tough test to do. And it needs to be replicated, but it's a 2-day exercise test, which you can imagine is tough to do, where you have someone exercise, measuring their ability to, essentially engage in anaerobic versus aerobic energy. And then when you bring them back the next day, that ability, called VO2 max, really drops out. But practically speaking, this is not something that's really possible to use in the clinic. So obviously I do hope that we can find something at a cellular or blood level.
The Institute of Medicine report did reference that particular test if somebody is having difficulty diagnosing a patient, and it is used for disability in this country to prove functional impairment.
Another question.
I was just looking to ask about the NIH funding. It's eluding me right now, but the study that was just debunked, I don't know if it was PACE or things like that. So it goes to Michael and the panel. Do you think that that will change the perception of the disease and on a scientific level as far as funding? I mean, I know it's one study, but I mean, the community's been begging for them to debunk that study for years, and it's finally come. So I don't know your thoughts on that.
So Michael, yeah,
So he's referring to a study that's known by the acronym PACE, P-A-C-E, which is, I sort of alluded to it before, which is the idea. There's a group of influential psychiatrists, largely based in Europe and the UK, who think that this is sort of a socio-psychosomatic condition in which people, sort of assume the sick role and it becomes important to their identity. They've made arguments in the past that this is a condition for the age of Facebook, where someone looks on a patient support group and sort of becomes, they feel like this is part of their identity. Perhaps just not exercising enough has caused them to deteriorate. I don't think it's a valid. I think it's incorrect. I think that's the most important thing we can say. But the problem is this study was published in a really prestigious journal. I think that there are serious problems with the methods, and I think that they unfortunately did a really triumphant press tour after their study came out. They showed a 12% improvement on subjective measures. Now again, that's a questionnaire, which is quite different than some biological test. The question of whether this study has been debunked, I mean, unfortunately, that's not a binary. It's still is in a prestigious journal. I think that there's enough pushback from enough scientists, with fancy institutions on their name, where people are starting to realize that there's at least some controversy. But as to whether or not this affects NIH funding, at the risk of starting a sort of a conflict here, I feel like there's a bit of a split where in the United States, maybe you guys can disagree with me on this, but I feel like researchers in the United States are a little bit more focused on the biological aspects. And in Europe, they seem to be sort of ruminating on the social-psycho components. Of course, attitude matters. It matters in multiple sclerosis. It matters in breast cancer. But could you imagine a research program focusing relentlessly on the attitudes of people with multiple sclerosis or breast cancer? It wouldn't make sense. But in terms of NIH funding, I mean, we can always use more. Trump threatened to cut the NIH budget by 20%. That's, overall, I mean, luckily there was a pushback to increase NIH funding, but that NIH funding would make a big difference, not just on this condition, but also the broad, what we call basic science, where you're just trying to understand mechanisms. How does mitochondria work? Mitochondria in neurons moves around in the neuron, depending on where in the neuron the mitochondria is most needed. We don't know a ton about that. It's called mitochondrial trafficking. This is research that can be done in rats that has, nothing directly to do with this condition, but it's basic research that would help us understand some of the mechanisms.
So any billionaires in the room?
Is there any prominent people that are involved in CFS?
Yes, there are some.
They're putting money up, or?
Yeah, in some cases, yes. I mean,
There's people trying to target those individuals as well, as you can imagine, trying to get that private funding because we haven't been able to get the NIH funding increased quickly enough to be able to meet the demand that we have and the urgency.
I think we might only have time for one more question. Yes?
It seems that the problem of suicide with people who are severely affected with this has not been addressed, and I would like to suggest that there is some kind of a movement to offer them help as the veterans are being helped.
So what do you do about the risk of suicide?
I think that I work with patients who are chronically ill. Almost all of my patients are chronically ill with one condition or another. And it is very, very difficult Obviously, they need support. They need support from those close to them, their friends and family. They need support from their doctors. It is really demeaning to go from doctor to doctor and be told that the physical symptoms you're having are all in your head. But I don't really have an answer to that. You know, we all need to care about these folks.
All right, that's it. Thank you very much for your questions. One moment. Rita would like to say something.
Hi. First of all, thank you to Deborah Becker for this wonderful panel. And to each of our panelists, Michael Van Elseker, Mary Dimmick, Kiki Zeldis, and Lisa Hall. And thank you to the audience. I also want to thank Leland, Ryan, Wayne from the Regent, and also Brad Bromfman for filming it. This will be on YouTube. And if you want to help us make this tipping point a real tipping point that spreads around Boston and around the US and around the globe. There's 17 to 20 million people with ME around the globe. We hope that you will help us bring this film to your community, especially if you're a healthcare professional. So please get into contact with me or the Mass CFIDS organization. Just go to our website, Mass CFIDS, contact us through the Contact Us button, and say, I am a healthcare professional at X, Y, and Z institution. I'd like to bring the film to my institution. Thank you all so very much for coming.